episode of Inquire, the show that aims to bring people together from across a wide range of different worldviews in order to explore ideas and share life. I'm your host, Jez Field, and it's great to have you with us today for another exciting conversation and episode. In today's conversation, I talked to a good friend of mine, Aj Cilliers, who was part of the original founding group of people who discussed all these ideas and topics in the pub down the road from here. And we talked about near-death experiences, something that AJ's been fascinated in for over 10 years. AJ himself is an ex-academic and for many years was an atheist until recently when he got baptized as a Christian. Part of his journey comes up in the conversation that we have. I'm sure you'll find it fascinating. I had no idea, no thoughts, no clue about anything to do with near-death experiences, and it altered the way I think about death. It was very interesting, and I have a lot of questions, unanswered questions, but questions all the same. And now, as ever, I kicked off the conversation talking to AJ by asking him the question, what is one of your life's greatest discoveries and why? And this is what he had to say. Check it out. But firstly, AJ, hello and welcome.
Thank you, Jez. Hello to you. Jez, I'd say probably one of my greatest discoveries is that God answers prayer. Now, to a Christian, that wouldn't be surprising, but to someone like myself, who, as you say, was in the wilderness for many years, pretty much as close to an atheist as you could get, but at the same time searching for meaning and always coming back to religion as a potential source of meaning, because either there was a God or there wasn't, or there is a God or there isn't. And in asking the question, and actually asking the question of God, I got a surprising answer. Something, almost a metaphysical experience or a spiritual experience that went beyond anything I could have imagined, and that then led me to start exploring Christianity in far more detail. So I guess that would rank as probably the most important discovery.
Wow, that's a fantastic discovery. And is that something you've experienced not just when you became a Christian, but as a Christian now? Is prayer something that's quite important to you?
Yes, definitely. And I've found, particularly over this recent period during the coronavirus crisis, the lockdown and so on, I've been challenged in a number of ways, financially, in terms of mental health, I think, as has been the case with many of us. And almost counterintuitively, I've found that no matter how bad things might seem or how challenging things might seem, prayer has always brought peace and an overwhelming feeling, really, that things will be well, all will be well in the long run, and certainly has helped me to get through this period. And yes, it's become a constant or a regular part of my life.
Wow, and we, no doubt in the course of the conversation, we're going to talk about things relating to how you became a Christian or became convinced that there is a God and that he is knowable. But I'm really interested to talk about near-death experiences with you, because I know this is something that, as you said yourself, you've looked into for a long time. You've read a lot of books around, but I remember back in the pub, back when we were allowed to socialize in public.
Right. The good old days.
You presented an evening on near-death experiences, and prior to that, I'd never heard anything about this. I'd never considered it, and suddenly you're laying out theories and academic papers and books, thinking, goodness me, there's a lot more to this. Whenever I think of near-death experiences, AJ, I think of the kind of fairly trivial, nearly died moments. You nearly get hit by a bus. You think, oh gosh, near-death experience, but it's much bigger than that, much broader than that. So I don't pretend to understand this at all. So please help me grasp more of this. Tell us, what do we mean, or what do you mean when you talk about near-death experiences, and why have they become something that you're so interested in?
Right. Jez, I think I first heard of near-death experiences back in 1975 when my parents bought a book which had just been published by Dr. Raymond Moody, an American physician, who had, in discussions with his patients, had heard some amazing stories. Patients who had suffered a cardiac arrest, in other words, their heart had stopped beating, they'd been clinically dead, some of them for quite a period of time, 5 to 6 minutes, 10 minutes, and so on, had returned from these experiences of being clinically dead to tell some amazing stories of experiences they've had while they were ostensibly dead, and that he termed the near-death experience. And it was at a time too where, I was brought up in a Christian home, but I drifted away from Christianity. So I was in my mid-20s at that stage, and this really made me think, because if there was any validity to this, then a lot of what Christianity was saying appeared to be true as well, which as a sort of newly minted atheist was a little bit disturbing. So that was my introduction to near-death experiences. And over the years, I've maintained that interest, because the actual study of near-death experiences by academics and by scientists or medical scientists has developed tremendously. And although atheists deny that it is any kind of a metaphysical experience, the evidence seems to be pointing more and more towards these being a genuine experience that you can't explain by our current scientific and medical knowledge.
Wow. Okay, so there's lots of questions. So why, as a newly minted atheist, why was this something that troubled your atheism? Let's start with that.
Okay. Perhaps I should give you a short introduction to what is entailed, what a near-death experience involves, and then I can more easily answer that question, Jez. What happens, and if we take the example of a cardiac arrest, so we've got someone in hospital, they've had chest pains and so on, they're conscious, but while they're, say, in the hospital on a bed, suddenly they will have this heart attack or the cardiac arrest, their heart stops beating. And within 20 to 30 seconds, no more oxygen is getting to the brain, they lose consciousness. And if they connected to an ECG, which is an electrocardiograph, which would measure their heart output, or an EEG, measure their brain waves, both of those would flatline, so that there would be no measurable activity in terms of heartbeat or brain activity. And at that point, they would be regarded as clinically dead, even though there's not, cell death hasn't occurred at that stage, but some people who return from that, miraculously as near-death experiences, others don't return. So you can't predict from that stage who will come back and who won't. Now, in about 20% of cardiac arrest cases, people will suddenly find that after this tremendous physical pain and the experience and losing consciousness, they suddenly find themselves floating up near the ceiling of the room they're in, looking down at this body on the bed that is being worked on by the medical staff. And at first they don't recognize themselves, and then they realize that the body below them is in fact their body. And there's this amazing feeling that, how can they be down there and up here at the same time? So that, of course, was the first disturbing thing from our point of view, because if our consciousness can actually exist outside of our physical body, then that suggests that perhaps death is not final. And it also suggests that there could be a greater consciousness, a greater, consciousness without a body, which we would call God. So that was the first disturbing aspect. And people in this state, the interesting thing was that as these people were floating above their body, looking down at their body, they were extremely alert. They described their consciousness as more focused and brighter than it had ever been before. They could read the minds of the medical staff working on them. They could see clearly what was happening in terms of their resuscitation, and they could describe in great detail later to the doctors the procedures that were carried out, even though from their position on the bed, they wouldn't have been able to see these things. So it seemed very much as though these people were actually in this position somewhere up near the ceiling, looking down at their bodies. So that was the first stage of the near-death experience. And as I say, certainly worrying from an atheist point of view.
I mean, it's just fascinating. And there's so much in there. So this is something that I think you've said before has generated some interest among the scientific community as well. It's not like a loony fringe of religious, spiritual people that are interested in these fascinating, novel, out-of-body, transcendental moments. This is actually something I remember you saying before has had academic journals, peer-reviewed journals written about. Is that true? I mean, how many?
Absolutely right. I mean, there are now a number of specific journals dedicated to near-death experience research, and which is being carried out by academics. But even back in early 2000s, a Dutch cardiologist had the first prospective near-death experience study. So that means they looked at people who'd had a near-death experience over a period of years and reported on their experiences. And that was published in The Lancet, which is a mainstream medical journal, a highly regarded mainstream journal. So back in the early 2000s, the medical profession was beginning to take note. And since then, there have been hundreds of studies, and some of them ongoing at the moment, where, for instance, because two of the big objections raised against near-death experiences were the fact that because there's a lack of oxygen to the brain, doubters or atheists said that the near-death experience was caused by this lack of oxygen or by high levels of carbon dioxide in the blood. Now, in the prospective studies, what the doctors do is they get permission from people who have had a cardiac arrest, who are brought into hospital to be treated for heart problems. They are granted permission up front. If these people were to lose consciousness and have to be resuscitated, could they take certain blood samples to test blood oxygen levels and so on? So people have given this permission, and so doctors have been able to test the oxygen levels of people who've been unconscious, been resuscitated, and not had a near-death experience, and compare that to people in the same position but who have had a near-death experience. And they've been able to prove that low oxygen levels are definitely not the case, not the cause of near-death experiences. So that's the benefit of these type of studies.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a commonly heard and understood, commonly heard thing when people have near-death experience. They talk about the light, going towards the light, and
right.
I remember watching something that explained that medically, what's going on inside the brain, that your brain is being filled with filled with some kind of chemical. I don't know, but I just heard, so that it isn't actually, you're not actually dying. There's no actual light. It's just a malfunction in the brain or something. You've probably heard that. What do you think?
Yeah, there have been those sort of experiences. Other people are saying that, while having a near-death experience, although there's no noticeable activity in terms of brain activity, no breathing, no gag reflex, so despite all of that, people are marginally conscious, and the bright light of the operating theatre or the theatre is what they're misinterpreting and seeing that as a light. But it's interesting that you mention the light, because that describes the next phase of a comprehensive near-death experience, because a comprehensive near-death experience has about 8 or 9 stages.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I want to come on to the other stages. Let's stay in stage 1 then. I don't want to run ahead. So stage 1 of a scientifically documented near-death experience, of which you're saying there have been now hundreds of these verified studies done.
Absolutely.
Hundreds of people. Which is a lot. I mean, it's not millions, but it's still a lot of people who have signed up for these experiences. And you're saying that in 20% of people who have cardiac arrests and die and then come back from the dead, 20% of them claim to have had some initially an out-of-body experience where they look down on their body.
Right. Okay. That's right. And of the 20% who have this this out-of-body experience, 20% of 20% of the total people who have near-death experiences have the comprehensive near-death experience. So 20% of all heart attack victims have a near-death experience, and 20% of those experiences have the comprehensive experience.
And the comprehensive is all 8 to 9 steps.
That's right, which we can run through briefly.
So I mean, that's just fascinating that in the first instance there's this so people can look down on their body and report back to doctors afterwards things that from their position on the bed they would never have seen. I remember you saying about them, talking about which drawer they got what tool or item from.
Absolutely.
And yet there'd no way they'd have known that lying down.
Right.
So when you were investigating this, so you've been interested in this for a while, longer than you've been a believer, longer than you've been a Christian.
Sure.
So I remember in the pub watching our dear friend Dr. Paul Frost's kind of confused expression, desperately trying to find, or not desperately, but recognizing the potential challenge that this, reality would face to his belief that the world is entirely made up of matter.
Right.
I suppose we're not saying that this isn't a material substance that we are as in our consciousness. We don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But as an atheist, how did you square some of that or make sense of some of this?
Well, it was difficult, Jez, because I couldn't dismiss this. As you say, Paul is a pretty committed atheist, and I think it certainly got him thinking, but he wouldn't admit, certainly not in the evening, he wouldn't admit to seeing this as significant. But it definitely did bother me that our consciousness could survive outside the body, and especially when research showed too, because what part of these studies involved was, especially once they had a sample of people who had had a cardiac arrest and no near-death experience compared to those who had had the near-death experience, what they found, they questioned both groups of people after the event and asked them asked them to describe how they believed they were resuscitated. And the people who had near-death experiences got something like 92% of the events they got correct, whereas people who had not had the near-death experience got less than 50% right. So again, it's very hard to explain that away unless it's a genuine experience, unless these people in some way were outside their body. And it seems remarkable, when you hear them saying things like, well, we could hear what the medical staff were saying. We could even read their thoughts. And one doctor that I've subsequently read of, on his way to the hospital in the morning, he was involved in a little bumper bashing, and he was concerned because this was in America, and he was concerned that the person he'd driven into would sue him because of whiplash injuries and so on. And this was on his mind when he actually was working on someone or trying to resuscitate a patient. And later on, this patient said to him, when he'd survived, he explained that he'd had a near-death experience. And he said, Doc, when I was up there near the ceiling, I could tell that you were thinking and worrying about the accident, but you mustn't worry. Someone like you who does so much good for people, no harm will come to you. So he was able to pick up on that. And the doctor said, obviously, he'd hardly discussed this with the patient. So, and there are a lot of these anecdotal sort of stories which doctors say they just cannot explain. Even those who take a very materialistic point of view, they say, well, there's certain things we don't understand, and I don't try and think about those things. But I believe we should.
Yeah, a convenient way of not answering the problem, and it is a complicated problem. It's not something we can. Yeah. It's mysterious. I mean, we'll go on to talk about the stages after this one, but I think this one's quite key because it potentially unlocks the existence of a consciousness. The conversations for materialists anyway always stop at, no, I am just a machine. There is no soul and spirit. When I die, I'm just switched off, and that's the end. But we've often talked as Christians that the problem of consciousness is a big problem for atheists, because how, at the very, if we're willing to believe that life came from nothing, getting conscious life from non-conscious matter, as I think we've spoken before, that's a whole nother giant leap of faith, or a giant leap of mystery and into the unknown. How did that occur?
Absolutely.
So that's why I think this is such a big issue. Obviously, it's not the sort of thing that people can easily just change their mind on based on some anecdotal evidence. But you're saying there are books people can read if they're interested in looking into this more. Where would you send them? To the Moody book?
Yes, the Moody book is a good starting point. Then there's a very good book that was written by Dr. Pim van Lommel. He's the Dutch cardiologist I mentioned, whose article was published in The Lancet. He's written a book about the science of the near-death experience. But or you can, I think, even if you just Google near-death experience authors on Amazon, you'll find a number of books coming up. There's a Dr. Melvin Morse who's done a lot of work researching NDEs by young children and by blind children, which is really fascinating as well, because these children who've been blind from birth are still able to describe what they've seen in terms of resuscitation and everything, much like adults. And again, so it takes a further level of complexity. How can blind people see this sort of thing?
Gosh, this I suppose at this stage we're just contesting for consciousness. We're not promoting or aligning ourselves with any particular religious tradition of what happens after death.
Sure.
And I guess you can see how in human history across the civilizations, spirituality and religion is something that when a member of a community has a near-death experience like this, you can see how that then lends itself to something that a community and society starts to grab hold on as being evidence of an afterlife, long before scientific studies and things have been going on with cardiac arrests. This sort of thing must have been happening in civilizations down through the ages, which is part of an explanation perhaps as to why every civilization anywhere in history has had a belief in a non-material part of reality, gods and God, etc. So, but let's come on next. What happens in the stages after this, where this, I think, is where as a Christian it raises questions. Sometimes it affirms Christian positions, perhaps, but not always. So, tell us what happens next.
Okay, so the next stage is that, as I say, once after hovering up near the ceiling for a period of time, people suddenly find themselves drawing away from the scene of the resuscitation at great speed, and they find themselves, or they describe it as pretty much as a tunnel experience. They're traveling up this very dark tunnel, but in the far distance, they can see the speck of light, and as they travel, the tunnel seems to be angled slightly upwards. Most people describe it in that way. As they travel towards this light, the light gets brighter and brighter until they emerge into this unbelievably bright light. As they say, brighter than anything they've ever experienced on Earth, and yet, strangely enough, it doesn't hurt their eyes, although, of course, they don't physically have eyes at that point, because they're not in a physical body, but that is just the experience and, what occurs to them. And what they then realize is that in this light, they can make out a being. So someone with a physical form. Atheists tend to describe the being of light as the creator of the universe. Religious people describe it as God. And in a number of instances, probably more so than any other particular description in terms of Western near-death experiences, the being of light is described as Jesus or Christ, and quite often appears physically very much as we have heard Jesus described, with the long robes and long hair and beard and so on. And what they sense from this being of light is a feeling of unbelievable unconditional love. They say, unconditional love doesn't begin to describe it. You can't actually put it in words. And so much of the experience, people say, that the word is ineffable. It's just not possible for them to describe it. But the love is beyond anything they've ever experienced on earth, and that love is directed towards them, and they just know that they are, loved beyond measure. And also at the same time, it doesn't all happen in a linear sort of process, but something else that happens when they emerge into the light is that people have a sort of universal understanding. They have an understanding of how the universe functions, what the purpose of it is, what their life is all about, and that some of them even get understanding of subjects like quantum physics and so on. Now, for most people returning after the near-death experience, those memories or that knowledge, they don't bring back with them. But in a few isolated cases, people do bring back knowledge. And there's a recent one in the last few years of a lady, I think Egyptian or Iranian, who had a near-death experience and who had never studied quantum physics in her life, but this was revealed to her, advanced aspects of quantum physics. She came back, enrolled for a degree, and at one of the near-death experience conferences, in a video call, her professor spoke on her behalf and said that they were still astonished by the level of knowledge she had, and some aspects of this, they said there's no way she could have learned this from any course or any books on advanced quantum physics. And some of the material that she was able to, or some of the concepts she was able to share with them, they were only beginning to be able to verify months after her experience. So it begs the question, how on earth is that possible? And again, we have this verified by an independent academic. So it's certainly more food for thought. So that's the second phase. So the next
let's go to that phase. I've got some questions, as you might, I guess, from that, because that there's. So firstly, atheists have these as well.
They do, which again, I mean, some atheists will return after the experience and say, many of them will become spiritual afterwards. They may not go as far as becoming religious, but many will certainly start adopting spiritual practices and will believe that life exists after this.
Wow, I mean, even in that first stage, it's interesting to me because a lot of the themes that you say most people or a lot of people experience seem to line up very much with Christianity, the idea of God being light, the idea of unconditional love, and yet those aren't necessarily concepts you'd expect for other religions to have at their core. So what's the correlation of experience like based on cultural upbringing? Do Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus have similar experiences, or are they suited to their own cultural background and heritage?
That's a good point, Jez. There definitely are cultural aspects to the near-death experience, and it's almost as though people are being shown, or the near-death experience is sort of attuned to them, or presented in such a way that culturally it will make sense to them. That's one way of looking at it. Or one could say that one's culture determines how you interpret the near-death experience, because although not a lot of work has been done on looking at various cultures, there are research into certain Indian near-death experiences in India shows that people interpret or see different gods, or there are certain messengers of the dead who appear to dying people according to certain of the Indian religions, and people having a near-death experience. Indian people report on seeing or having this kind of experience. But most of the stages or phases of the near-death experience, whatever the culture involved, they are very similar. What is quite interesting too is that in a couple of cases, for instance, I remember reading of a Jewish woman who had a detailed near-death experience who met Jesus, and found that really surprising because, as she said, she didn't believe in Jesus. And other people also from Middle Eastern backgrounds, but certainly not Jewish or Christians, who also reported meeting Jesus, which was certainly interesting.
Yeah, but like you said, for some within their culture, they see or interpret what they see through their cultural lens. So would a Muslim see Muhammad, or would they see someone who's categorically Muhammad, or would they see someone that they later interpret as Muhammad because that's what they've been thought to think?
Yes, I think certainly they will say something like there was this being of light and they knew in their heart that it was Muhammad. So whereas a Christian might very well say, I knew that was God, or I knew that it was Jesus. But sometimes.
Sorry, go on.
No problem. I was just going to say that sometimes the being of light is simply seen as the being of light, and people can't really see features and so on. Whereas at other times they appear quite clearly, with Jesus being reported as the person was, yes, the figure seen most regularly.
And I mean, you mentioned just then, you kind of threw out that this lady had gained a degree or knowledge of quantum physics. Yes. Was it a conference? There are conferences for these near-death experience conferences where you go and plug yourselves into some machine and try to have a near-death experience.
No, there's been discussion around that possibility, Jez, but no, these conferences are really to discuss near-death experiences. So professionals who study them, but then also people who've had near-death experiences, and increasingly people within the medical profession themselves are having near-death experiences. So they are reporting back at these conferences, and which again is beginning to lend credibility to the field, because a lot of the medical professionals will admit freely that beforehand they would never have thought this possible, and would have not considered to be a genuine experience, whereas that their mindset changes completely after the experience.
I think what we're seeing, and I remember I watched a TED talk on this a while ago, that the scientific method, good though it is, has had too much weight of expectation placed on it alone to be the primary form of knowledge that's going to lead us as a species into complete understanding of the world, and that bypasses and overlooks the other massive aspects of how we gain knowledge in valid ways outside of just the scientific method. You mentioned a few here, but experience is a valid and different form of knowledge to the scientific method, as is socially passed on knowledge through the traditions that we've got and various things. So it's quite interesting. So I'm conscious of time, and I want us to rush through the rest of this experience. And you said we're on step 2 of 9. So give me the last 7 in a bit of a whistle.
Yes. So if we run through the rest of it. So after meeting the being of light, having this universal consciousness, understanding of the workings of the universe and so on, people are then presented with a life review. So sometimes in 3 dimensions, sometimes as if they're watching a movie, they will see either every incident from their life or certain selected incidents. And this will be, the life review will be in the presence of the being of light. And people make the comment that they are judging their own behavior. But what is interesting is that quite often the scenes that are shown them are obviously being the decision as to what scenes to show are coming from the being of light, and So although they're saying they're not being judged by the being of light, in a way there is a judgment happening, but it's happening in a very loving way, because they're not being harshly judged or condemned, but they're made to feel very much aware of where they have gone wrong. And the basis of judgment is love given or love withheld? So where have they acted in a loving way? Where have they been less than loving, or even been cruel or unpleasant? And beyond just understanding it, they are made to actually feel the emotions that the people who were affected by their actions, the emotions that those people felt. And so they literally feel their pain and their anguish and so on. So that's a tremendously powerful experience. But as I say, at the end of it, they still feel, despite whatever negative actions there might have been, there's still this overwhelming sense of love and understanding expressed by the being of light. And then after that, after the life review, people suddenly find themselves in what is quite often almost an earthly environment, but very beautiful. Sometimes they'll find themselves in a meadow, or there'll be just a beautiful natural scene with a river running through a meadow, or there'll be a wall. And on the other side of the sort of obstacle, whether it's a river, a wall, a fence, or whatever, they see people who have predeceased them, and mainly family members or close friends and so on. So they will see people who've died before them. These people will be there, and they can communicate with them. They say there's no verbal communication. It's almost a mind-to-mind communication. And they'll get, again, an overwhelming sense of love and affection from these people. But ultimately, the message that is conveyed to them is that it is not yet their time, and that they must return to their physical body. And many people, most people, in fact, say that they would far rather stay there, because it's such a wonderful experience. They feel so loved. But the message is that they must go back, and quite often, probably 80-90% of the time, they're told they must go back because they still have work to do. And people learn during this near-death experience that they come into this life to learn very specific life lessons. And so if all the lessons haven't been learned, then they have to return to their bodies. And normally at that time, whether they agree to it or not, they tend to very shortly afterwards regain consciousness in their bodies. So
and does it normally result in quite significant life change for people then, those that come back?
Yes, very definitely. And that is really significant, because people who have a cardiac arrest, no near-death experience, there's no real lasting effect, or certainly no lasting positive effects. Whereas people who've had a near-death experience, the first thing is that they no longer fear death. They say they know beyond any doubt that they are eternal beings, that after the physical, their life on earth is over, they will be returning to that environment. So they no longer fear death. The other interesting thing is that if they were ambitious or very materialistic beforehand, they lose that ambition, they lose their materialistic outlook. Those things are no longer important to them. Many of them make changes into caring professions. Some will become ministers of religion, but invariably money and status and wealth are no longer important. So become far more caring. They are also, after an initial unsettling period, because it takes quite a while to integrate this experience into their worldview. Yeah. But once they've done so, they are psychologically much healthier people, much healthier than average. And the interesting thing is, where people have had a near-death experience as a result of a suicide attempt, they hardly ever attempt suicide again, because they understand during the near-death experience that is wrong, that we do not have the right to end our own lives. And they say that differs from people who have attempted suicide, not had a near-death experience. They say a suicide attempt is probably the strongest indication that people will attempt suicide again. Whereas those who've attempted suicide, had an NDE and recovered, almost hardly ever. So again, interesting. These people also, they're far more empathetic. They've come to understand that humanity is connected. We are all one, and that any harm we do to ourselves or any harm we do to others, we're effectively harming ourselves. And that ultimately love is what it's all about. And we must be living love as much as we can. So again, strong parallels with Christianity.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of strong parallels to Christianity throughout that. There's obviously some aspects of those experiences that don't parallel Christianity.
Yeah.
So I believe that Jesus needed to come. Jesus needed to die because humanity's big problem is our separation from God that's caused by our sin. Christ's death was a death to liberate us from the power of Satan, sin, and death, essentially. And yet, in the description of what you're saying, there's no judgment of sin. There's no the emphasis from Jesus is that eternity is being with the Father. It's not necessarily being with loved ones, although there's indications to have hope for that. But the primary focus is being with the Father, and of course there's eternal separation from God in hell after judgment. And so those themes seem to be missing from those experiences, which I'm not. So I'm just kind of interested. We've got different forms of knowledge. You've got the scientific knowledge, but then we've also got the scriptural revelation of knowledge, and I take them both very seriously. But I'd really like to know how you, as a Christian, process and assimilate and reconcile some of those differences.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about the judgment and about hell and so on. What I didn't mention is that although they are in the minority, a number of people, probably again about 20% of people, or perhaps not that high, maybe 10% of people who have had a near-death experience actually have what they call a hell experience. And one that particularly struck me was someone who had an experience and who saw the being of light as Jesus, and Jesus took this person through various stages of the experience. And one of the things he did was to take the experiencer to a place where these souls were in torment. These were people who'd been hugely successful and had in material sense and in terms of power and so on, had been very successful in the earthly realm, and yet were in absolute turmoil. And what this fellow said to Jesus is, are these people condemned forever? And he said, no, at any time they can ask, and God will take them out of that place. But there was very much, it was almost as though those people had placed themselves in hell. And one sort of thinks of Jesus saying or describing how difficult it would be for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And perhaps, if one were to, because as you say, one's got to question the validity of this whole near-death experience and of the details. But, could it be that perhaps by our actions and developing perhaps an overly powerful ego and believing that we are virtually gods, then in the afterlife finding it very difficult to submit to God. So it's so interesting. But then I guess where it differs from Christianity, it's not a life in an eternal life spent in hell. There is still the option of God's mercy and to be taken out of that, but it requires people to ask, so possibly salvation after death. Who knows?
I don't know if you saw the TV show The Good Place that's been on Netflix. Have you seen the TV show The Good Place?
No, I haven't.
Well, I mean, it sounds like a lot of the images that you're describing kind of borrow from this kind of just a comedy sitcom. But right. What the sitcom does do, quite interestingly, when it tries to talk about people's good deeds outweighing their bad deeds, just show how incredibly difficult that is to ever really quantify, because there are unintended consequences to so many of our actions. And who's to say, what's a good deed when it's weighed on the balance of a globalized one humanity, for example, and the actions of someone who buys a certain product that adversely affects some poor peasant farmers in Indonesia or whatever. And so
Right.
it kind of makes light of that reality, but it does
Yeah.
seem like these near-death experiences kind of just, yeah, it kind of, I don't know, what are your thoughts on how do you really know? Because again, for me as a Christian, I don't
Yes.
think I can get into heaven being with God through good behavior. That again, that seems to me that I am trapped by my sin, and I am under the wrath of God, but Jesus has set me free. So now I'm
Right.
no longer condemned, but it requires Christ to die in order to free me from sin. Um,
Yeah.
and it's not a question of me being weighed in the balance and, oh, if I didn't know Jesus's death and I wasn't under his atoning sacrifice, oh, it's okay because I've helped a few people. When it's actually offense against God rather than just my neighbor. The Christian
Yeah.
seems to be concerned about judgment. You've given this a lot of thought. So where do you come down with how much emphasis and authority you give to these experiences versus what you see in Scripture?
Yeah. That's a really difficult one, Jez. I think you and I have spoken about belief at times, and how I think what I've come to realize is that where there is no certainty, and in so many areas, even if we take near-death experiences, if we take scripture, can we say hand on heart that we are 100% convinced that that is true? Can we prove it? And quite often that proof doesn't exist, and then belief comes down to choice. Because I've done quite a bit of reading in the areas of how we come to believe what we believe, and it's fascinating. A lot of it is an emotional choice. Some psychologists believe that cultural factors, determine our choices, but ultimately, I believe where absolute truth is not knowable, we choose what we're going to believe. So, and I mean, it's really difficult, as you say, because even if one looks at Jesus from the point of view of a near-death experience, for instance, and aspects of Jesus's life, I mean, the very fact that he died and was resurrected. Now, that is a massive problem for most non-believers because people don't come back from the dead. But now we're discovering, well, in fact, science is showing people do come back from the dead. So now I'm not suggesting that Jesus had a near-death experience, but what I'm saying is that it does seem that this person running the universe, or this entity or God, will decide at times that people return to life if they have something important to carry out. Now, what could have been more important than Jesus's task on earth? To save mankind or humankind. So from that point of view, one can see how, and I mean, what I didn't mention, for instance, is that some people are having a near-death experience. One extreme case, a lady had stage 4 brain cancer with tumors the size of lemons in her brain. She had hours to live, had a near-death experience, was told that she would return to life if she chose to because she has work to do. But she said, well, I'm horribly disfigured and I'll have brain damage. And I said, she was told if she chose to return, she would be healed perfectly and there would be no scars. She had huge lesions and open wounds on her body because of the cancer. She was told she'd have to have skin grafts. Those all healed naturally. Her brain cancer disappeared. She had a miraculous return to life. And this is verified. A skeptical doctor or cancer oncologist, he contacted her and said, do you mind if I consult all your records, hospital records? She gave him permission, and he said, I just cannot explain this, lady, you should be dead. So in the same way that people after near-death experience recover very quickly from physical ailments, Jesus in the same way could have recovered from his flogging and from being stabbed with a spear. Again, this goes beyond our materialistic conceptions, and it sounds like science fiction, and yet we're seeing now in modern science is saying or showing or experience is showing that this is happening. So why could it not have happened back then? So there's so much in terms of, I think my biggest struggle is actually reconciling that, because as we say, the overwhelming Christian belief is that Jesus had to die to free us from sin. It's not something that we, as you say, good deeds alone will not save us. And it was that supreme sacrifice that did save us. And then, so as you say, a lot of what near-death experience suggests is that we are all essentially saved, although then one also has the hell experiences. So how do you reconcile that? It's difficult. I
guess you have to make up your mind who Jesus was, because if he was just another man on another mission and got sent back from the dead because he had work to do, then I guess that takes you down one avenue. But of course, as a Christian, I don't think he was just another man. I think he was God incarnate. He was the Word of the Father that's pre-existent, who entered time and space in a human body and was fully God and fully man, which is the Christian tradition of who Jesus is.
Yes.
And Jesus is coming back to life was not a returning from the grave. He appeared in a resurrected body that could teleport effectively, move in and out. Matter didn't pose an obstacle for him. And at his leaving of Earth, he ascended, levitated up into the sky until he was hid by clouds. And so there are obviously, it's fascinating, AJ. There's just so much here that it's interesting. Whenever I hear things that I don't immediately see how they fit and reconcile with pre-held beliefs, I think there's always an experience to want to fight tooth and nail for the orthodox position that you held on to before. But what I always enjoy is just allowing myself to sit in that feeling of dissonance for a time to go,
right.
This is interesting. Let's let this sit, let this be. Let's explore this from different points of view. Let's read up around this. I always think of what Francis Schaeffer famously said, that ultimately the book of nature and the book of God will agree with one another. The more we understand the book of nature and the more we understand the book of God, the Bible, there ultimately will be no battle between the two of them. And whose understanding of scriptures have matured, developed, evolved over time as we've understood so much more about the world and the context it was written into. Equally, our understanding of science and the natural world or the created world, the book of nature, we've understood so much more. And I think rather than trying to set these in opposition with one another, we have to we have to hold both authorities and alongside one another, rather than saying scientific method trumps the Bible. And if science says that I can't see it in the Bible, but I'm going to believe science. No, actually, as a believer, I hold both equally and say, no, there is ultimately going to be a way that these two will agree. That would be my comment on those, on how I kind of initially hear what you're saying and try to process this. Although obviously I'm going to have lots of questions and lots of reasons to go, I'm not sure about this, or what do you think about that? But I mean, there's a lot of it that seems to resonate and feel quite interesting and exciting, and at the very least, I suppose, give people hope that life doesn't end at the grave, but equally should get people to think now. If you know you're going to stand before the transcendent being that created everything and be told to give an account of your life, you might want to not live an unexamined life, shall we say, and begin to consider whether, because ultimately I think life's purpose is that we know and enjoy a relationship with God. That's how he's designed us. We find our peace and our rest in him, not just after death, but here now, don't we? And so that's as we kind of draw things and this conversation to a close, we're going to leave lots of questions unanswered and things hanging. What's in your mind right now is kind of just concluding thoughts, comments, where you're at as a Christian and a lot of processing this, anything at all? What would you want to say?
Yeah, I think what is significant, Jez, is that, I don't think one must make too many firm conclusions on the basis of what we're learning from near-death experiences. Because what I find interesting is that some people have had a near-death experience. I mean, one person describes, for instance, Jesus saying to him, what have you done with your life? And you know that I died for you? So you're having those kind of messages. Some people come back and immediately join a Christian church, and some even go into the ministry. So, if the near-death experience was consistently saying, oh, well, organized religion is wrong, or Christianity is wrong, or that's not happening. And so we must just be careful. I think we must hold our beliefs around near-death experience, hold them lightly. I think they're very encouraging, because, as you say, there's so much. We believe that the Bible is divinely inspired, and so much of what is coming out of near-death experiences is in correlation with what we read in the Bible as well. God is love. We're told that God is love. If you go to Corinthians chapter 13 and read what St. Paul says about love, that sounds like unconditional love to me. And, so there's so much. Christianity, essentially, if one were to say, what is the essence of Christianity, it probably is that God is love. He loved the world so much that he was prepared to send his son to redeem mankind, or to give us the opportunity to redeem ourselves through his grace. That is a pretty big deal. And you're right, it does. We are going to have to give account. It certainly seems that whatever you believe, we're going to have to give account for ourselves. And I think that should inform how we live our lives, as you say.
And I think, you're right to almost draw the line where you do and say, this is a lot of interesting things in here. We should hold it lightly and not treat it too authoritatively and all the details. However, the overriding message from this is there is a consciousness that is distinct from your body. Traditionally, we call that a soul. And there is evidence that after life you meet God.
Right.
That seems to be where the encouraging aspect for a believer can be taken from these studies. It seems like this is close to empirical evidence of consciousness.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely, Jez. I would agree with that 100%.
Which is very encouraging. And
I think
you're gone.
No, I was just going to say, I think the other encouraging thing is that I don't see anything in the Christian beliefs that would, or anything in Christianity that I would feel I now have to give up, or beliefs I now have to shed to be in line with what I've learned from near-death experiences. As you say, I think there's so much that confirms that Christians are pretty much on the right track. And as you say, the big thing is that there is a God. We do survive bodily death, and we're going to have to account for our lives one day before him with a capital H.
Well, AJ, I think it's been fascinating to crack this subject open with you. We haven't had a chance too much to hear how you made that journey from atheism to Christianity, and so perhaps we'll have to have another conversation in the not too distant future where we can discuss that together. But thanks so much for your time. Thanks for sharing. And I'll put a link to the book that you mentioned in the notes below, so people can look up that book. Thanks so much, AJ. God bless, and look forward to catching up with you soon.
Thank you, Jez. It's been great. Really nice chatting to you.
That's the conversation with AJ. What do you think? I hope you've enjoyed your time listening in today. Thanks for paying us a visit. Remember, if you enjoyed the content that you heard today, don't forget to hit the like or subscribe button so you can be kept up to speed and up to date with all the latest conversations as they happen. It's been great being together. I look forward to catch up with you again soon. God bless. Goodbye.